The fluorescent lights above the maternity ward hummed in a low, steady rhythm, almost like they had become the hospital's unspoken soundtrack. Their glow spilled across polished tiles and sterile white walls, every corner gleaming with antiseptic clarity. But to Mateo, Hamilton, billionaire entrepreneur, master of boardrooms, and darling of Wall Street, headlines. The lights might as well have been sirens. They blared against his temples, illuminated truths he could not yet process. He stood frozen in the corridor of St. Mary's Hospital in Manhattan, his tailored coat hanging awkwardly from stiff shoulders, a figure carved out of disbelief. His gaze was locked on the glass partition of the neonatal ward. Beyond it, 5 bassinets arranged neatly, each a tiny vessel adrift on a sterile sea of soft linen and pastel blankets. And in each of those bassinets, a pair of eyes. Not just any eyes. His eyes. Mateo's reflection stared back at him, multiplied 5-fold sharp blue irises that had once graced the covers of Fortune and Vanity Fair, praised as ice-like, unflinching the eyes of a man who could stare down competitors and conquer entire industries. Yet set into faces barely days old, those eyes seemed unbearably fragile. Blinking unfocused, unaware of the storm they had ignited, his throat tightened. A rush of air left him like a man gut-punched, though no one had touched him. His heartbeat stumbled faster, louder, until even the faint shuffling of nurses faded into nothing but background haze. 5. 5 children with their eyes. It was impossible, and yet undeniable. For 15 years, Mateo had lived beneath the shadow of a quiet truth. He was sterile. The diagnosis had come when he was only 19, delivered with the sterile detachment of doctors who spoke in genetic codes and probabilities. Their words had no softness, only the certainty of science. They explained that his body carried a rare defect that clipped the future at its roots. He remembered sitting in that clinic in Boston, staring at the dull beige walls as his life was quietly rewritten. He had not cried, not once. He had redirected the ache into something else, into the empire, into Hamilton Dynamics, the company he built from nothing but code caffeine and relentless hunger. If he could not leave behind heirs of flesh, he would leave behind a dynasty of innovation and wealth. He had made peace with it, or told himself he had. But this unraveled everything. Mateo pressed his palm against the glass, his breath fogging the surface. Each tiny chest rose and fell with mechanical rhythm, each hand curled into fragile fists. And all he could think was, they should not exist. Not with my eyes. The sterile world he had built so carefully contained began to collapse under the weight of that truth. Memory arrived with the sharpness of a blade. Harper Grant. The name crashed into his chest like a struck chord, reverberating with longing and regret. Harper, her laugh had once been his favorite song. Her mind a sparring partner sharper than any executive he had ever hired. She had walked into his world at MIT like a storm wrapped in sunlight, and she had walked out 2 years ago. He remembered the note on his counter penned in her looping handwriting. I can't breathe in your shadow anymore. Half the apartment was empty by noon that day, her warmth erased, as though it had never lived there. 2 years of silence. 2 years of burying the shape of her absence beneath acquisitions, press interviews, and late-night strategy sessions. He had told himself she had chosen freedom, that she wanted no part in the weight he carried. And yet here he stood, staring at 5 children, with his eyes children, who could only be hers. The rumor had reached him almost like a joke whispered at a gala in Soho, half slurred by a politician's wife who claimed Harper had been seen at St. Mary's with babies. Plural. He had laughed it off, dismissed it with the precision of a man allergic to irrationality. But the whisper had clung to him, gnawed at him, until dawn found him in his car, driving through streets he rarely touched, without an entourage, guided only by instinct. And now, instinct had delivered him here. A nurse approached quietly, her shoes making only the faintest scuff against the polished floor. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked, her voice gentle, practiced in caution. Mateo tried to speak, but only air left his lungs. "Are you here for someone?" she pressed, tilting her head. He swallowed hard, managed 2 words. "Harper Grant." Recognition flickered in her eyes. She consulted the chart, then slightly nodded. "Room 912. Visiting hours end in 30 minutes. The number branded itself into his mind like scripture. 912. Mateo forced his legs to move. Each step toward the door felt heavier, like trudging against invisible currents. His empire had taught him control, precision, and an almost arrogant mastery of motion. Yet every stride felt foreign, as though the ground questioned his right to advance. He stopped halfway down the corridor. Something pulled him back, the irresistible tether of that glass window. He turned once more, gaze colliding with the newborns. One stirred, a tuft of dark curls peeking beneath a tiny cap. The infant's eyes fluttered open, meeting his through layers of glass and chance. Blue, unmistakable. It was no mistake, no trick of light. Truth had a way of undoing men. And in that instant, Mateo Hamilton, billionaire visionary architect of dynasties, was not undone by markets or enemies or failure. He was undone by the quiet opening of a newborn's eyes. This was not the beginning of the reunion. It was the beginning of reckoning. The life he had built, fortified by walls of certainty, was now fractured. Every headline, every accolade, every speech he had given about legacy crumbled into ash compared to the weight of 5 tiny souls who carried his gaze. And somewhere behind a hospital door, Harper Grant waited. Mateo reached room 912. The frosted glass distorted the figure within a woman, slender, her shoulders narrower than he remembered, but unmistakably hers. Harper stood with her back to him, dark curls gathered in a loose bun, a lullaby slipping softly from her lips as she cradled one of the infants. The sound pierced him, both alien and familiar. He had heard that voice hum against his ear in nights of exhaustion, soothing him from coding marathons. Now it wrapped around another life. Their life. He raised a trembling hand and knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. She stiffened, pivoting slowly. Her gaze lifted to the door, casual curiosity sharpening into stunned recognition. Their eyes met through frosted glass. 2 years collapsed in the silence between them. Mateo opened the door. His breath was shallow, his body taut like a man stepping into fire. Harper. He said her name, leaving him more like a prayer than a word. She did not answer. The infant stirred in her arms, a soft whimper, anchoring them in present reality. She shifted instinctively, rocking with quiet authority, soothing the child with the ease of someone who had done it 5 times over. "I saw them," Mateo managed at last, but his voice fractured the babies. Her gaze flickered almost imperceptibly, then a single nod. Yes, that was all. He stumbled back half a step, the affirmation striking like a hammer. "They have my eyes," he whispered. For a fraction of a second, Harper's composure faltered. Her voice was soft but steady. "Yes, they do." The ground beneath Mateo tilted. "How?" "I was told that you were infertile," she finished for him, her tone neither cruel nor forgiving, but unvarnished truth. He nodded, shame clinging to his chest like iron. "So did I," she admitted. "Until I found out I was pregnant. I ran every test. Turns out the diagnosis wasn't conclusive. Rare. They said your early results missed the viable counts." Mateo's breath fractured. His entire existence, the stories he had told himself, the fortress of resignation he had built, crumbled in those words. He searched her face. "Did you know?" "Before you left Numb." Her answer was immediate, sharp. "I found out weeks after. I tried to call you. I changed my number," he confessed, voice low, "after you left." "I know," Harper said flatly. "I emailed, messaged your assistant. Nothing." Her tone was not bitter, but it cut him deeper than rage could. He had shut every door too tightly, convinced she had abandoned him, when in truth he had made himself unreachable. He wanted to speak, to bridge the canyon carved between them. But words failed. All he could do was look at Harper, at the child in her arms, at the shadows of exhaustion under her eyes, at the quiet ferocity of a woman who had carried 5 lives without him. Strength, sacrifice, and perhaps beneath layers of hurt, a flicker of love that refused to die. Mateo swallowed hard. "I want to know them. The children." His voice broke. "I want to know you again, if you'll let me." For the first time since he entered, Harper's expression shifted. Not softened, but cracked a sliver. "You can start," she said, extending a small bottle toward him. "This one's hungry." Mateo's hand trembled as he took it. The infant peered up at him, eyes heavy-lidded, curious. He lifted the bottle, clumsy, terrified, and for the first time in his life, Mateo Hamilton was given something he could not buy, outwit, or negotiate. He was handed his daughter. The world outside St. Mary's continued as always, traffic buzzing, stock tickers, updating, investors waiting. But inside room 912, time shifted. Mateo sat with the child in his arms, feeding her awkwardly, his gaze tethered to her breath's fragile rise and fall. Her name, he realized suddenly. He didn't even know her name. Leora, Harper said softly, as if reading his thought. "It means light." Mateo repeated it under his breath. "Leora. Light." And for the first time in years, something fractured inside him began to glow. As you listened to this chapter of Mateo and Harper's story, perhaps you felt the shock of impossible truths, the ache of regret, or the fragile hope of second chances. If even one moment stirred something in you, I'd love to invite you to stay with us. This journey is only beginning. If the story touched you, consider giving it a like, commenting with your thoughts, or following the channel to avoid missing what happens next. Because the moment Mateo looked into those newborn eyes, everything changed. And trust me, what comes after this door opens, you won't want to miss. The bottle trembled in Mateo Hamilton's hand, as if it had its own will. The baby Leora latched instinctively, her small mouth drawing milk with a delicate and determined rhythm. Mateo sat stiffly, his body betraying his fear of failure, but Harper's voice reached him from across the room, low and steady. "Support her head." He adjusted under her guidance, awkward but careful, as though he were holding not a child, but some fragile relic too sacred to be trusted to his clumsy grip. Harper stepped closer, not touching him yet, close enough that her presence carried reassurance and a reminder she had done this alone 5 times over without him. Mateo inhaled slowly, the air thick in his chest. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking-faced reporters' ambushes with calm steel. But this, feeding a daughter he had only just learned existed, shook him to his core. Leora's eyes fluttered shut as she drank. Tiny lashes brushed her cheeks, her face softening into serenity. Mateo stared, caught in the spell of her innocence. For the first time, the word daughter did not feel like an impossibility. It felt terrifyingly real. When the bottle emptied, Harper crossed the room and gently retrieved the infant, her practiced hands moving with the ease of repetition. She laid Leora against her shoulder, patting her back until a soft burp escaped. The sound was almost comical in its smallness, yet it struck Mateo with unexpected force, an echo of everything he had missed. Quintuplets, Harper said at last, her tone stripped of embellishment. 3 girls, 2 boys, Leora Noel, Sienna Micah, and Gabriel. 5 names, 5 lives. Mateo repeated them silently, as if carving them into memory. His chest tightened. He wanted to say anything, but words dissolved before reaching his tongue. How he whispered finally the question, a plea. How did you carry this alone? Harper's expression did not waver because I had to. The simplicity of her answer was sharper than an accusation. It left no space for excuses. Silence settled heavy, but alive. The kind of silence that carried too many unsaid things, too much history crammed between 2 people standing inches apart, yet separated by years of choices. Mateo forced himself to meet her gaze. I thought you left because you didn't want me. Her lips pressed together, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. I left because I couldn't breathe anymore. Everything revolved around your world, your company, pace, and rules. I stopped existing as myself. The words stung not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I didn't know how to stay, Mateo admitted. His voice was low, stripped of its usual command. Building something bigger would make me matter more. I thought, if I gave you everything except myself, it would be enough. Harper shook her head. What I needed wasn't everything. It was you. The baby in her arms stirred again, fussing. Harper rocked gently, humming the same unfamiliar lullaby Mateo had heard moments before. He watched her, unable to ignore the contrast, her weary posture, the exhaustion etched into her face, and yet the fierce tenderness with which she cradled life. Guilt hollowed his chest. He said you did all this, gesturing faintly toward the bassinets beyond the wall, without me. Yes. Her reply was neither bitter nor forgiving. It was a fact. I should have been here. You weren't. The simplicity of it crushed him. No dramatics, no accusations, just the stark reality of absence. He sank into the chair by the bedside, elbows resting on his knees, head in his hands. For a man whose empire never allowed collapse, the gesture felt foreign but inevitable. His mind replayed the sterile glass window, the eyes of 5 children staring back. His children. He remembered the times he had imagined fatherhood in some abstract, safe form, knowing it would never come. He had allowed himself to picture it in moments of weakness, precisely because he believed it impossible. And now reality had carved those imaginings into flesh and blood. He said, I want to know them at last, lifting his head. His voice cracked not with authority, but with longing. I want to see every detail, what calms them, what they need, the sound of their cries. I want to know them. Harper studied him. Her eyes held fatigue, wariness, and something else, a guarded ember of hope she refused to fan. Then start by listening, she said. A soft cry interrupted them. One of the bassinets down the hall carried the restless sound, muffled but insistent. Harper moved instinctively, but Mateo stood first. I'll go. She hesitated, measuring whether he could be trusted with even this small act. Finally, she nodded. Mateo stepped into the ward. The room was dimly lit, filled with the faint scent of powder and milk. He found the source, Noel's tiny face, scrunched in discomfort, fists waving. He bent down, heart thudding. He had no idea what to do. Clumsily, he reached for the pacifier Harper had left near the crib, pressing it gently to her lips. After a moment of resistance, she accepted it, sucking softly. The cries subsided, replaced by a sigh. Mateo froze, staring. The victory was absurdly small, yet monumental. He had quieted his daughter. Behind him, Harper appeared in the doorway, watching silently. For once, her expression softened, if only slightly. When he returned to the room, she settled Micah into her arms. The boy fussed legs, kicking his small mouth, twisting into a scowl so familiar it startled Mateo. "He has your glare," Harper murmured. Mateo's lips parted half in disbelief, half in wonder. To see himself reflected in such tiny expressions felt surreal. Micah squirmed, the fussing escalating. Harper handed him over without warning. "Your turn." Panic surged in Mateo's chest. He held the child awkwardly, the baby's cries growing louder. His head, Harper reminded, adjusting his grip with brisk efficiency. Firm, but gentle. Mateo followed, fumbling. Micah's tiny fists thrashed his cry sharp. "What now?" Mateo asked desperately. Harper's tone was calm, almost amused. "Try patting his back like this." She demonstrated on her arm. Mateo mimicked, tentative at first, then firmer. Micah's cries faltered, then softened into hiccups. His small face pressed against Mateo's chest. Breath evening. Relief swept through him like a tide. He looked up at Harper, and for the first time she did not avert her gaze. The night stretched into a blur of feedings, fussing, and lullabies. Mateo remained learning in silence, fumbling through tasks Harper performed instinctively. He sterilized bottles under her watchful eye, his movements stiff but determined. He cradled Sienna, while Harper soothed Gabriel, their motions strangely in sync, as if some forgotten rhythm between them had begun to stir again. Hours slipped by unnoticed. Exhaustion pressed on his shoulders by dawn, but a strange clarity lingered. Mateo sat by the window, watching the city stir awake. The skyline washed in lavender light, taxis beginning their endless circuits. For the first time in his life, he did not care what deals waited, what markets had opened. The empire he had built could run without him for a day. But these children, this woman could not. Behind him, Harper lowered into the chair, her body heavy with fatigue. Her eyes closed, if only for a moment. Even in weariness, she radiated strength, the kind forged in fire, not celebrated in headlines. Mateo watched her, something breaking inside him, something he had walled away. "I was wrong," he said softly, almost to himself about everything. Harper's eyes opened, tired but clear. "You can't erase the past," she murmured. "I don't want to erase it. I want to learn from it." She studied him as though weighing whether this was another promise destined to dissolve. Silence stretched, but it was not empty. It was thick with possibility, fragile as glass. Finally, Harper looked away, her hand resting lightly on the bassinet beside her. "They don't need words, Mateo. They need presence." Its simplicity sank deeper than any lecture could. Presence. Not power. Not wealth. Not declarations. Just presence. Mateo leaned back, eyes falling on the 5 bassinets. Each one carried a piece of him, of Harper, of a future he had once believed impossible. Perhaps for the first time he understood that legacy was not lines on a stock chart or skyscrapers with his name. These were tiny breaths, fragile fingers, and the woman who had carried them when he had not. He turned back to Harper. "I'll be here," he said quietly, "even if I fumble. Even if you don't trust it yet, I'll be here." Her gaze lingered on him, steady, unreadable. She did not reply. But she did not tell him to leave either. And for Mateo Hamilton, that was the first step of redemption. The hallway outside room 912 grew quieter as the hospital settled into its midnight rhythm. The hum of machinery replaced the bustle of daytime rounds. The beeping monitors softened to steady pulses, and the glow of fluorescent lights gave way to dimmer hues. Inside the room, the world shrank to the cadence of 5 newborns, their cries rising and falling in unpredictable waves. Mateo Hamilton sat on the narrow cot a nurse had wheeled in for him, though it hardly deserved the name bed. Its metal frame creaked at the slightest shift, and the thin mattress bore no comparison to his accustomed luxury. Yet he made no complaint. In truth, he barely felt it beneath him. His attention was tethered to the 5 bassinets lining the opposite wall like gravity. Harper moved among them, like someone who had lived in this rhythm long enough that her body no longer asked permission. Her steps were quiet, her hands precise, her voice steady, even in fatigue. She lifted Gabriel with one arm while preparing Sienna's bottle with the other, all without breaking the flow. Watching her was like witnessing a dance born not of elegance, but of survival. Matteo wanted to help, but his body hesitated at every turn, as though afraid to intrude. He had spent a lifetime commanding rooms, but was a novice waiting for instruction here. Finally, Harper broke the silence. "You can hold Leora. She'll need another feeding soon." The invitation startled him. He rose at once, crossing the room as though drawn by invisible strings. Harper guided him with the barest of words, adjusting his arms, ensuring the baby's head was supported. Leora nestled against his chest, her warmth seeping through the thin cotton of his shirt. The small weight anchored him in a way billions of dollars never had. Her breath brushed his skin in small bursts, soft and irregular. He lowered his head, inhaling the faint scent of milk and powder. For a moment, the noise of the city, the weight of his empire, the scars of his past, all of it fell away. There was only her. The hours blurred. Time lost its usual order, replaced by intervals of cries, feedings, burps, and lullabies. Each child demanded in turn, pulling Matteo into tasks that stripped him of any illusion of control. At one point, Noelle began to wail, her voice high and unyielding. Matteo reached for her, panic rising as the cries grew sharper. Harper stood nearby, arms folded, observing without interference. "She doesn't like the overhead lights," Harper finally said. Matteo glanced up disoriented, then quickly dimmed the lamp above the crib. The effect was instant. Noelle's cries softened into a whimper, then settled into soft hiccups. A laugh escaped his chest, short, incredulous. "You know all their secrets?" "I've had to learn," Harper replied. Her tone was steady, but the exhaustion in her face betrayed the cost of that learning. Matteo looked at her, really looked. The weariness carved into her features was not the fleeting fatigue of late nights. It was the profound, bone-level exhaustion of someone who had carried more than one person should. And still, she stood. Still she moved. "You shouldn't have done it alone," he murmured. Harper's eyes flicked to him, sharp, unreadable. "But I did." The truth of it left no room for reply. By 3 a.m, the room had settled into a fragile quiet. 4 babies slept, their small chests rising and falling in synchrony. Only Micah remained awake, fussing intermittently, as though determined to test every ounce of Matteo's patience. Matteo cradled him, bouncing gently, humming under his breath. The tune was off-key and clumsy, a habit he hadn't realized was still in him. He remembered Harper teasing him about it when he tried to cook, and she said his humming could scare the garlic out of the pan. To his surprise, the sound worked. Micah's fussing softened, his eyelids fluttered, and slowly he surrendered to sleep. When Matteo looked up, Harper was watching. She said nothing, but her lips twitched the faintest ghost of a smile. It vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, but he had seen it. For a moment, the room was filled with something that had nothing to do with bottles or bassinets, something older, something they both remembered though neither dared to name. Later, Harper lowered herself into the armchair, her body sinking like it had carried a mountain. She closed her eyes, head tilted back, one hand resting loosely on the armrest. The shadows under her eyes told their story, nights without rest, hours without reprieve. Mateo stood quietly, unsure if he should speak. The weight of his own exhaustion pressed on him, yet he knew hers was heavier. She had borne 9 months of pregnancy, 36 hours of labor, and now 10 days of endless vigilance. Alone. He wanted to say he was sorry, but the word felt inadequate. Instead, he whispered, "Sleep. I'll watch them." Her eyes opened weary, but wary. "Don't promise what you can't keep." "It's not a promise," he said. "It's what I'm doing." For a long moment, she searched his face. Whatever she found there, it was enough. She let her eyes close again. Mateo turned to the bassinets, his chest tightening. 5 small lives lay in his care. For a man who had spent his existence building empires, this was the most fragile power he had ever held. The hours that followed were a quiet storm. Sienna stirred first, her cries, sharp enough to slice through the silence. Mateo fumbled with the formula, his hands unsteady, but determination anchored his movements. He measured, poured, and tested the temperature against his wrist. When he brought the bottle to her lips, she latched eagerly, her small hands curling against his shirt. The feeling was indescribable. To be needed in this way, not as a leader, not as a provider of wealth, but simply as a presence, unraveled something deep inside him. Next came Gabriel, restless, until Harper's half-conscious voice directed Mateo pressure on his chest. "Right here." She demonstrated this with her palm against her sternum, before drifting back into shallow sleep. Mateo followed her instruction, pressing gently, and watched in awe as Gabriel calmed. By dawn, Mateo had stumbled through each child's needs, clumsy, yet persistent. He had not closed his eyes once, but did not feel regret. He felt strangely alive. When the first light of morning crept through the blinds, Harper stirred. She blinked slowly, the waking born of instinct rather than rest. Her gaze swept the room, pausing when she saw him. Mateo sat slumped on the cot, Noelle tucked against his chest, her tiny fist gripping the fabric of his shirt. His eyes were heavy, his posture weary, but he was there. He had not left. For Harper, the sight was both foreign and disarming. She had built walls against hope for 2 years, teaching herself to expect absence. Yet here he was, disheveled, exhausted, but present. "You stayed," she said softly, almost to herself. Mateo looked up, his eyes rimmed with fatigue, but steady. "Where else would I be?" The words were simple. They carried no grand declarations, no promises gilded in wealth. But something in Harper's chest shifted, fragile and unwilling, yet undeniable. The nurses arrived for morning rounds, bustling quietly, checking vitals, recording numbers. The room filled with clinical efficiency, yet something far less measurable remained beneath it. Mateo watched Harper as she moved to assist, her steps slower now, her body carrying fatigue she could no longer conceal. He wanted to reach for her, to shoulder even a fraction of what she took, but he knew trust could not be seized. It had to be earned. When the nurses left the room, quieted again, Harper sank into the chair, rubbing her temples. "You shouldn't have to do this alone anymore," Mateo said. Her eyes lifted to his, guarded. "And yet you weren't here when it mattered most." The truth hit him like a blow. He wanted to argue, to explain, but he knew explanations would only sound like excuses. Instead, he bowed his head. "I can't change the past, but I can be here now." Harper studied him, the silence stretching until it felt unbearable. Then she exhaled, long and heavy. "We'll see." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance. But it wasn't dismissal either. And for Mateo Hamilton, that was enough for now. As the morning sun brightened the room, he stood by the window, watching the city stir to life. Manhattan stretched before him, relentless as ever, its towers gleaming, its streets humming. For years, it had been his kingdom. Yet now, in this small room, with 5 bassinets and 1 exhausted woman, he realized this was the only empire that mattered. He turned back, eyes falling on Harper the children, and the fragile possibility handed to him not with fanfare, but with bottles, diapers, and sleepless nights. And Mateo Hamilton understood the weight of presence for the first time. The morning after his first night in room 912 unfolded with deceptive calm. The sun filtered through the blinds in soft slats, dust motes dancing in the golden light. The world inside the hospital seemed to stretch in muted rhythms, the faint hum of machines, the soft whimper of an infant, waking the rustle of Harper adjusting her cardigan as she rose from the armchair. Mateo Hamilton sat by the window, a half-empty paper cup of hospital coffee cooling in his hand. Though heavy from exhaustion, his eyes carried a clarity that had not existed the day before. He had survived the night, not as an executive or a man in control, but as a father fumbling in the dark. The feeling was raw, unpolished, but undeniable. Harper stood over Leora's bassinet, smoothing the blanket with precise movements. The silence between them was no longer hostile, but it was not gentle either. It lived in a liminal space full of weight history and fragile possibility. "Your company will notice you're gone," Harper said quietly, her back still to him. "They'll manage," Mateo replied. She turned then, her eyes steady, skeptical. "They always call you when the market sneezes. And now you've disappeared for 2 days. Someone will notice." Her words hung in the air, a warning more than a prediction. By midday, the prediction became reality. Mateo's phone buzzed relentlessly on the small table beside the cot, first with texts, then calls his assistant, his COO, and his head of communications. The screen lit up in waves of urgency. He ignored them. But Harper noticed. She picked up the device, glanced at the notifications, then set it down without comment. Her silence carried its own edge. "They'll be fine without me," Mateo said, though the tension in his jaw betrayed him. Harper arched a brow. "You've built your life on being indispensable. Do you think they'll just let you vanish?" The truth of it pressed against him. He had always been the axis around which Hamilton Dynamics spun. His absence, even for 48 hours, was a disruption. And yet for the first time, he felt no urge to return. That evening, the disruption broke beyond boardrooms. A nurse entered the room carrying a folded copy of the New York Chronicle, her eyes flicking between the paper and Mateo with poorly concealed curiosity. She left it on the counter before slipping out, but the headline was visible even from across the room. "Whispers of an Heir Billionaire. Mateo Hamilton, spotted at St. Mary's." Harper stiffened. Her hands froze on the bottle she was preparing. Slowly she turned toward him. "You've been seen." Mateo crossed the room, taking the paper into his hands. The article was speculative, stitched from whispers and vague sightings, a nurse's hushed comment, a visitor's blurry photo of his profile in the corridor. Nothing confirmed, but enough to ignite curiosity, enough to fan the flames. Harper's voice cut through the silence. "This is what I was afraid of." He looked up, his chest tightening. "Harper, you walk into this room and suddenly the entire city knows where I am, what I've been protecting." Her tone was controlled, but her eyes, burned with anger, held tightly at bay. Mateo set the paper down, the weight of her words heavier than newsprint. "I didn't plan for this." "No," she said sharply. "You never plan for the cost to anyone but yourself." The accusation sliced clean. He had no defense. The days that followed unfolded like a storm building on the horizon. Outside, whispers grew. Paparazzi lingered near the hospital entrance, lenses poised. Online forums buzzed with speculation, some claiming Mateo was secretly married, others weaving stories about heirs hidden away. Inside room 912, the tension thickened. Harper grew quieter, her movements sharper. She shielded the children from the sound of his phone buzzing with increasing urgency. One night, she finally spoke as he sterilized bottles under the harsh fluorescent light. "What happens when they publish pictures?" Mateo looked up startled. "You think they won't?" Harper pressed. 5 babies, Mateo. Born to a woman you once loved. To a man the world watches like a hawk. They'll swarm us. They'll tear apart whatever peace I've tried to build. Her words trembled at the edges, not with fear for herself, but for the children. Mateo's chest constricted. He wanted to promise protection, to vow he could shield them from the weight of his name. But even as the thought formed, he knew the truth. His name was both sword and shield. It had built an empire, but invited scrutiny as relentless as rain. He said, "I won't let them hurt you," his voice steady. Harper's gaze held his unflinching. "You can't control them, Mateo. You never could." The next morning brought proof. As he stepped into the corridor to fetch water, a flash erupted, camera shutters snapping like gunfire. Reporters had slipped past security, their questions sharp, merciless. "Mr. Hamilton, is it true you've fathered quintuplets? Who is the mother? Is it Harper Grant? Are you finally admitting you're not sterile?" He froze, stunned, not by the questions, but by the speed with which they had reached him. A guard intervened, ushering the reporters away, but the damage was done. When he returned to the room, Harper stood rigid, her arms wrapped protectively around Sienna. Her eyes met his, hard with betrayal. "You said you wouldn't let them near us," she whispered. "I didn't know they'd—" Her laugh was bitter sharp. "You didn't know. You're Mateo Hamilton. The city breathes your name, and you thought you could slip into a hospital unnoticed." The accusation echoed undeniable. That night the rift between them widened. They worked side by side, caring for the children, but the rhythm of cooperation from the nights before was gone. Silence filled the spaces where quiet understanding had begun to grow. Yet beneath Harper's anger, Mateo saw something else. Fear not for herself, but for the fragile lives asleep in bassinets. Fear that the world outside would consume them before they had even begun to live. And in that fear, Mateo felt his own resolve sharpen. The following day, his COO arrived at the hospital, a man whose suit was pressed so sharply it looked like armor. He cornered Mateo in the hallway, voice low but urgent. "The board is panicking. Stocks are jittering. They need a statement. If you don't address this, the market will write its own story." Mateo glanced back toward room 912, where Harper sat with Micah in her arms. He lowered his voice. "I'm not leaving them." "Then at least give us words," the COO pressed. "Deny, confirm something. The longer you stay silent, the louder the rumors grow." Mateo hesitated. For years his instinct had been to control the narrative, to bend perception into his own shape. But now the story was not his alone to tell. "I'll speak," he said finally. "But not about stocks, not about damage control, only about them." When he re-entered the room, Harper's eyes narrowed. "They want you to make a statement, don't they?" "Yes," he admitted. "And you'll do it." He met her gaze. "I'll do it for them. To stop the noise." She shook her head, disbelief etched into every line. "You think a statement will silence the world? You'll only feed it." Maybe he conceded. "But I won't let them write lies about you. Or about them." Harper's anger cracked for the first time, replaced by something raw. "What if I don't want the world to know at all? What if I want to raise them quietly without your empire swallowing us whole?" The plea cut him deeper than accusation. He stepped closer, his voice soft. "Then tell me how to protect that. Teach me, because I don't know how to live small, Harper, but I'll learn if it means keeping them safe." her lips parted, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a heartbeat, the distance between them thinned. Then one of the babies stirred, crying out, and the moment shattered. That night, Matteo sat in the chair beside the bassinets, unable to close his eyes. The storm outside their door grew louder, inching closer with every headline and camera flash. But within this room, the world was fragile, sacred, worth every sacrifice. He watched Harper as she rocked Noelle, her silhouette framed by the pale glow of the monitor. She looked like a woman carved from fire and glass, unbreakable, yet transparent in her weariness. And for the first time, Matteo understood the reckoning was not only about discovering he was a father. It was about learning to carry the weight of two worlds, the empire outside and the fragile constellation inside this room, without letting one destroy the other. He rose, moving to stand beside Harper. Their shoulders brushed a small contact that spoke louder than words. Together, they watched the child in her arms settle back to sleep. And though the storm beyond the glass was gathering, they held their ground. The hospital cafeteria buzzed with a muted hum, trays, clattering voices, hushed footsteps echoing on linoleum. But beyond its doors, the air outside was electric. By the 5th day of Matteo Hamilton's disappearance from the public eye, the city had begun to notice earnestly. Headlines multiplied like wildfire. News anchors speculated in clipped tones. Paparazzi crowded the steps of St. Mary's with cameras poised like weapons. And within room 912, silence held its own gravity. Harper sat by the window, one arm curled protectively around Micah, who dozed against her chest. The blinds were half drawn, but even from here, she could glimpse the swarm below the flashing bulbs, the restless crowd, the invisible net closing in. Her jaw tightened. The fragile cocoon she had built for her children was unraveling thread by thread. Matteo stood near the bassinets, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice, usually smooth and commanding, was taut with restraint. "I said no press statements without me. I'll handle this." From the other end came the frantic murmur of his COO words. Harper could not hear, but could easily imagine panic investors, stocks slipping with every unanswered question. Matteo ended the call abruptly, his gaze shifting to Harper. He looked at her, then at the infant sleeping against her heart, and uncertainty flickered in his eyes for a rare moment. "They want me downtown," he admitted quietly. "Board emergency. Shareholders demanding answers." Harper's lips pressed into a thin line. "And what will you tell them? That you abandoned me 2 years ago, only to show up when cameras caught you?" The words landed with precision. Matteo flinched, not because they weren't true, but because of how much weight they carried when spoken aloud. "I'll tell them the truth," he said after a pause, "that I have children, that they are mine." The air between them shifted taut as a wire. Harper's eyes darkened, fear laced in her steady voice. "And what about me, Matteo? What am I in that truth? A footnote, a scandal, or worse, a target?" He stepped toward her, but she held her ground, her grip tightening on Micah. "You're their mother," he said firmly. "That's not a footnote. That's everything." The storm broke that afternoon. Matteo left the hospital under heavy security cameras flashing like lightning as he slid into the waiting car. Reporters shouted questions, their words colliding into a chaotic chorus. "Are the rumors true? Is Harper Grant the mother? What about your infertility claims?" He said nothing. His silence was its own battlefield. At Hamilton Dynamics headquarters, the boardroom was suffocating with urgency. Suits lined the table screens, glowed with plummeting numbers, and whispers sharpened into accusations. "You've jeopardized the company's credibility," one director snapped. "Our investors are demanding clarity." Matteo listened, His hands folded, his expression carved from stone. He had been here before, rooms heavy with panic voices demanding control. But never had the stakes been so personal. When the din subsided, he rose. His voice was calm, but every word carried iron. I will make a statement, and I will not deny what is true. I have children. They are my legacy, not my liability. The room rippled with discomfort, but no one challenged him directly. They knew Mateo Hamilton was not a man who bent easily. Meanwhile, at St. Mary's, Harper paced the room like a caged storm. The babies had grown restless, their cries overlapping in sharp crescendos. Nurses came and went, their hands efficient, but their glances curious, lingering a beat too long. Harper felt the weight of those looks: pity, intrigue, judgment. When she paused to adjust Noelle's blanket, her reflection in the window startled her. She looked nothing like the girl Mateo had once loved at MIT, the one who challenged him in debates and laughed freely under skylights. This version of her bore hollowed cheeks, tired eyes, and a spine held rigid against the world. Her chest ached with the realization the life she had tried to keep private was no longer hers alone. By evening, Mateo returned. His shoulders carried the fatigue of battle. His tie loosened, his eyes shadowed with the weight of scrutiny. Harper said nothing as he entered, though the tension in her body betrayed her. He crossed the room slowly, lowering himself into the chair opposite her. It's done. The press conference is tomorrow morning. Her brows furrowed. Press conference? They won't stop until I speak. Better they hear it from me than spin it into a circus. Harper's voice sharpened. It's already a circus, and you just agreed to be the ringmaster. Mateo's jaw tightened. Would you rather I let them define us, call you names, question whether these children are even mine? The words hung like smoke. Harper looked down at Sienna sleeping soundly in her arms. The thought of her children's existence debated on television screens, dissected by strangers, made bile rise in her throat. She whispered, I wanted them safe, not famous. Mateo leaned forward, his voice quieter now. Safe is precisely what I'm trying to make them. That night, as the hospital slipped into its nocturnal hum, the storm inside room 912 reached a different crescendo. Gabriel's monitors beeped in sudden alarm. His small chest heaved unevenly, his cry weak, strangled. Harper shot to her feet, panic slicing through her exhaustion. Nurses rushed in, their voices sharp with instruction. Oxygen. Monitors. Hands moved quickly, precisely, urgently. Mateo stood frozen, his heart slamming against his ribs, as he watched his son's fragile body struggle. For a man who had always commanded control, the helplessness was unbearable. Breathe with him, a nurse instructed, guiding Harper. She leaned close, whispering to Gabriel, her chest rising and falling in exaggerated rhythm, as though willing him to follow. Mateo moved closer, his hand finding Gabriel's tiny fist. The baby's fingers curled weakly around his own, and in that fragile grip, Mateo felt the full weight of fatherhood. Not as a word, not as a claim, but as a responsibility heavier than empires. Minutes stretched into eternities. Then slowly, Gabriel's breathing steadied. The monitors calmed. The nurses exhaled in quiet relief. Harper sagged into the chair, tears streaking silently down her cheeks. She pressed her lips to Gabriel's temple, whispering words Mateo could not hear. He lowered himself beside her, his own hand trembling. I thought we'd lost him, he admitted hoarsely. Her eyes lifted sharp with a truth he could not escape. That's what it means, Mateo. To be here. To risk losing. To feel every breath like it could shatter you. The night passed with a fragile truce. They took shifts, Harper resting briefly while Mateo paced with Noelle, then Mateo dozing in the chair while Harper soothed Leora. The rhythm was imperfect, their silences heavy, but they moved like two people tethered by the same gravity for the first time. When dawn broke, the city outside was already alive with anticipation. Reporters clustered outside Hamilton Tower, their microphones poised for sound bites. Screens across Manhattan lit with headlines. Inside room 912, Harper buttoned Gabriel's tiny onesie with deliberate care. Mateo adjusted his cufflinks in the dim light, his reflection staring back at him from the window, a man divided between two worlds. Harper spoke without looking at him. If you stand there tomorrow and make it about you, your image, your empire, you'll lose us before you ever had us. He turned, her words landing with the weight of scripture. Then please tell me how to make it about you. About them. Her gaze met his, unflinching. Don't perform. Just stay. Not on a stage. Here. Mateo held her eyes, the storm of cameras already waiting outside, echoing faintly in his chest. For years he had mastered the art of appearances. But tomorrow, for the first time, he would stand not as the architect of an empire, but as a man trying to prove he could stay. That morning, as the first rays painted the skyline, Mateo Hamilton lifted Micah into his arms. The child squirmed, fussing, then settled against his chest with a sigh. Harper watched silently, exhaustion etched into her face, but something else lingered there too. Something fragile, unspoken, dangerously close to belief. The storm outside was breaking. The world was waiting. But within room 912, the reckoning was already here. The morning air in Manhattan carried the restless energy of a city bracing for spectacle. Barricades lined the sidewalks outside Hamilton Tower, cameras perched like predators, and microphones angled like spears. Reporters swarmed in clusters, their breath visible in the cold, their anticipation sharp enough to slice the air. At the building's entrance, security guards stood shoulder to shoulder, their presence futilely attempting to contain the storm. Inside, a podium had been erected in the marble atrium, where shareholders once mingled over champagne. The Hamilton Dynamics insignia gleamed behind it, an emblem of empire, now the backdrop for something far less calculated. Rows of chairs stretched before the stage, already filled with reporters clutching notepads, tablets, and cameras, all waiting for the moment the man of mystery would arrive. At St. Mary's Hospital, Harper Grant sat rigid in the chair by the window, her eyes fixed on the small television in the corner. The volume was low to avoid disturbing the children. Still, the broadcast carried its own heavy pulse. Breaking news: billionaire Mateo Hamilton expected to address rumors of fatherhood in an unprecedented press conference. Harper's heart hammered with a rhythm she could not still. In the bassinets, her children slept, their breaths steady, oblivious to the world beyond. She envied their innocence and immunity to the storm gathering in their name. Her fingers brushed against Leora's blanket, gripping the fabric as if to anchor herself. The idea that her life, her children's lives, were about to be dissected on national television felt like stepping toward an abyss. Mateo stood backstage, hands clasped behind his back. His reflection stared at him from the glass wall. Sharp suit tie, knotted with perfection, the same image he had worn for years. But beneath it, his chest was not armored. His heart thundered not for shareholders or headlines, but for 5 small faces, waiting in a quiet hospital room across the city. His COO leaned in, whispering in his ear, "Keep it concise. Stick to the facts. Don't get emotional." Mateo's jaw tightened. For the first time, he knew he could not follow that advice. The stage manager gave a nod. The cameras flashed. Mateo stepped into the light. The clamor was immediate. Reporters surged forward, voices colliding in a storm of questions. He raised a hand, and the room stilled, not wholly, but enough. His presence still carried weight. He looked out at the sea of faces. For years he had stood before them as a titan of industry, every word measured to inspire markets and command respect. Today, the man who faced them was different. "Thank you for being here." He began, his voice steady, but lower than usual, as though even the microphone could not disguise its vulnerability. "I called you together because speculation has become noise, and noise, when left unchecked, distorts the truth." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Pens poised, cameras whirred. Mateo inhaled, his throat dry. 2 years ago, I believed my life was destined without children. A diagnosis told me so. I built my legacy on that truth, or what I thought was truth. He paused. The silence was taut. But life has a way of humbling certainty, a way of rewriting stories we thought were already finished. He steadied himself, eyes locking on the cameras, as if they were the eyes of his children. "I am the father of 5. 5 children were born prematurely at St. Mary's Hospital. They are alive, they are strong, and they are mine." The room erupted. Questions hurled, flashes blinding. Mateo continued, cutting through the chaos with the weight of his voice. "Their names are Leora, Noel, Sienna, Micah, and Gabriel. They are not rumors. They are not scandals. They are lives, my life." At St. Mary's, Harper pressed her palm against her lips, her body trembling. Hearing their names spoken aloud, broadcast to millions, struck her with a force she could not describe. Pride and terror collided inside her, warring for dominance. She wanted to turn the television off to shield her babies from the world that now knew them. But she couldn't look away. Back at Hamilton Tower, a reporter's voice pierced the air. "Who is the mother?" The question carried venom, its subtext sharp. Mateo's eyes narrowed. He had anticipated it. "That is not for speculation," he said firmly. "Her privacy matters. What matters is that these children have a father who will not walk away." Another voice rose. "Mr. Hamilton, what do you say to critics who call this irresponsible? Who believes your absence from the company proves instability?" Mateo's reply came without hesitation. "If responsibility is measured only in profits, then call me irresponsible. But if it is measured in presence, in choosing to stand where I am most needed, then I have never been more responsible." Gasps rippled. The sound bites were already forming, ready to explode across networks. When the conference ended, Mateo stepped off stage into a blur of hands and questions, his security team closing ranks around him. But the noise no longer pierced him. He had said what mattered. For the first time, he had spoken not as a CEO, but as a father. Back in room 912, Harper sat frozen. The babies stirred in their sleep, as if sensing the shift in air. Her chest ached with conflict. She had feared exposure. Her entire pregnancy fought against the thought of strangers dissecting her choices, her worth. And yet, when Mateo had spoken, she had seen no exploitation in his face, only truth. But truth, she knew, came with cost. That evening, Mateo returned to the hospital. His tie was gone, his collar loosened, exhaustion carved into the lines of his face. Harper didn't look up as he entered. She was rocking Sienna, her motion steady, though her jaw was tight. "You said their names," she whispered at last. "Yes." Her eyes lifted sharp with unspoken fury. "Do you know what you've done? You've made them visible. Targets. They'll never know peace now." Mateo stepped closer, his voice low, but unwavering. "They'll know recognition. They'll know they are not secrets. They'll know they are wanted." Her laugh was brittle, bitter. "Wanted by the world. Or by you." "By me," he said firmly. "And the world can watch, but it won't decide how I love them." Harper's eyes glistened with tears she refused to release. "I've spent 2 years preparing for silence, for shadows. I knew how to protect them in the dark. But in the light, I don't know how to keep them safe. Mateo's hand hovered, then fell gently on the back of Sienna's blanket. Then, let me learn with you. Don't carry it alone. For a moment, the room pulsed with the echo of his words. The machines hummed. The babies breathed, the city beyond their window roared. And Harper, though her lips did not soften, allowed her shoulders to ease. Just slightly. That night, as the city dissected every word of Mateo's statement, Room 912 returned to its rhythm of feedings and lullabies. The storm outside was louder than ever, but inside the fragile thread between them held. Harper watched Mateo cradle Micah, the child's small hand, gripping his finger with instinctive trust. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire whose name filled headlines, but the man who stayed through nights of restless cries, who stood before cameras, not for himself, but for them. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. By the time the discharge papers were signed, morning had hardened into a bright, crisp noon. St. Mary's looked almost gentle in that light, a facade of brick and glass, catching the pale winter sun. Inside, though, everything moved at hospital speed, nurses with efficient hands, carts whispering along corridors, the quiet weight of endings and beginnings, pressing on the same air. Harper folded the last onesie with a care that felt ceremonial. Around her, the bassinets looked suddenly smaller, like boats readying for a river no chart had named. She smoothed a hand over Noel's blanket and glanced up at Mateo. "They'll let us go if we have car seats," she said. He nodded once. "We do." He had left at dawn and returned with 5 identical carriers' tags already removed, instructions memorized, as if they were the schematics of an acquisition. He had insisted on carrying them all himself, lining them like a small procession at the foot of the bed. The sight of them matching, ready, tilted something in Harper's chest. Preparation had always been her language. He had learned a sentence of it. A nurse came in with the stack of papers. "Everything looks good. Keep the monitor checks for the boys until next week and make sure their feed schedule stays." Well, you know the drill. Her smile softened at Harper, then flicked to Mateo, with the frank curiosity of someone who read headlines on her break. He signed where he was told to sign, his name precise and steady. His pen paused a fraction of a second longer over each child's line, like a quiet vow no microphone would ever catch. Outside, as persistent as the weather, the press waited. "They're still there?" Harper asked, nodding toward the window as she tucked the final bag of formula into a canvas tote. He didn't pretend otherwise. "Yes." She breathed out slowly. "Then we need a way that isn't the front lobby." "I've arranged it," he said. "Service corridor. Freight elevator. A van with no insignia at the delivery bay. 2 security guards are to walk behind, not beside." She looked at him sharply. "No parade." "No parade," he confirmed. For a beat, their eyes held. He did not reach for her hand. He didn't ask for permission. He waited, and when she nodded, relief didn't show anywhere but the slight exhale from his shoulders. They buckled tiny bodies into seats, checked straps, and adjusted hats. Leora blinked up at the ceiling, as if memorizing it. Gabriel's mouth worked a phantom rhythm. Sienna's leg kicked free, then settled when Harper tucked it back with patient fingers. Micah scowled somehow, both newborn and unmistakably himself. "Ready?" the nurse asked. Harper swallowed, as I'll ever be. They moved like a quiet brigade. Mateo took 2 carriers, then returned for the next 2, then the last, refusing to let anyone else touch the final one, though he didn't say why. Harper walked beside him, with a tote on one shoulder and a medical folder hugged close to her ribs. It should have felt absurd, a billionaire and a woman in a borrowed cardigan slipping down a service corridor like fugitives. Instead, it felt almost holy, something fragile being escorted, not displayed. The loading bay smelled like cold metal and exhaust. When the heavy door lifted, wind rolled through with the taste of winter. The van waited as promised. Plain, clean rows of seats that looked too large for the life about to occupy them. "Which borough?" the driver asked without prying. Brooklyn, Harper said before Mateo could answer. "Clinton Hill." The driver nodded, then fell into the quiet of a man who understood that not all questions earned answers. They crossed the bridge like threading a needle, Manhattan shrinking behind them in angles and rhetoric, the river below slate and restless. Harper watched the skyline recede through the smudged glass, her jaw set. Once that view had been a promise. Now it felt like the distance she needed. The babies made a constellation of small sounds. Leora hummed a barely there vibration in her throat, soft as a secret. Harper looked at her, the corner of her mouth easing despite everything. Mateo caught the sound too. He didn't comment. He just listened, as if learning a melody by breath alone. Clinton Hill met them with brownstones and bare-limbed trees. Stoops swept clean a deli on the corner, already arguing with its own radio. The van pulled up before a brick building with flaking paint on the lintel and a buzzer that looked like it had opinions. "Third floor," Harper said, and Mateo didn't hide the flicker that crossed his face. More calculation than complaint. 3 flights meant more trips. He rolled his sleeves without ceremony. A neighbor opened the front door on an incoming gust of heat and curiosity. She took in the scene, 2 adults, 5 carriers, the air of a private urgency, and stepped back without question. "Thank you," Harper said, meaning it. The stairwell smelled faintly of old varnish and someone's breakfast. Mateo carried 2 seats at a time, 1 in each hand, arms steady back straight. He took the steps without bravado, only care. On the second flight, his breath hitched. He didn't slow. Harper followed with bags and the folder, and glanced over her shoulder every few steps, as if danger might be disguised as kindness. At the 3rd floor landing, she unlocked a blue door, with paint worn off around the handle. The moment it swung inward, the apartment met them with warmth. Not heat warmth. A small table with 2 chairs. A plant on the sill is making an earnest effort against winter. A stack of books about infant care that had been read hard, their spines creased like foreheads. Foldable bassinets lined the living room like moons in a careful orbit. A single crib against the bedroom wall. The scent of clean cotton and something floral faint and familiar. "This is home," Mateo asked quietly, not as a judgment, but as a bearing. "It had to be," Harper said. She set the medical folder by the kettle, then knelt to unbuckle Leora, with the competence of someone whose hands had learned in the dark. He knelt too, for a moment. His body took up too much space. Rich man in a small room. But then he moved smaller knees on the scuffed floorboards, fingers clumsy, but trying. "Where do you want the seats?" he asked. "Against the wall for now." "Bassinets here." She pointed and he followed, aligning them with care, leaving room for a person to reach each without stepping on the other. Simple choreography. Silent respect. On the shelf above the couch, a notebook lay open. Rows of feed times, ounces, and minutes slept, marched across the page in tidy handwriting. Mateo read the columns and felt something pinch behind his eyes, a survival ledger kept without applause. "You did all this," he murmured, not meaning the ink. Harper didn't answer. She was busy adjusting Noelle's hat, smoothing her curls, in a gesture half habit, half benediction. He found a toolkit under the table. Cheap, practical, the tape measure wound like a snake. The crib wobbled when he tested it. "May I?" he asked, fingers already finding the loose joint. She watched him, cautious. "If you strip the screw, I'll never forgive you." "Noted," he said, a ghost of a smile there and gone. He tightened slow, measured turns, his expensively trained hands learning the torque of ordinary life. When the wobble stilled, he stepped back, as if the crib were a thesis passed. "Sturdy," he said. "I'll be the judge," she replied, pressing the rail. It held. Her eyes flicked to his. A point, tiny and undeniable, shifted in the ledger between them. Afternoon settled in with the grit of 5 small schedules. Harper moved through them with the focus of someone who knew chaos could be outrun if given enough structure. Mateo matched where he could, warming a bottle, forgetting a bib, remembering mid-spill, apologizing without drama. They learned the apartment together, which cabinet jammed, where the towels lived, the exact angle at which the living room lamp stopped flickering. When Sienna began to cry without reason, Harper could locate Mateo, who tried rocking, humming, and slowly walking from window to door and back. He discovered the rhythm more by apology than instinct. Sienna softened her face, smoothing into the sleep of someone who had won for now. He didn't crow. He only looked at Harper as if to ask if that was right. She didn't praise him. That wasn't her currency. But the glance she gave back wasn't nothing. Outside, late sun leaned across the brickwork, throwing honeyed squares onto the floorboards. The day did that thing days do, when they have been long and complex. It softened at the edges, letting forgiveness sneak in where certainty could not. And then there were knocks. Not the impatient press of a reporter's knuckle. Those had already found the wrong door downstairs. This was softer, familiar. A woman in a cardigan stood on the landing carrying a casserole covered in foil. The kind of kindness cities swear they don't make anymore. She said, "I'm 2 doors down," looking at the bassinets with a tenderness that made Harper's throat ache. "Heard you had babies." Plural. This is nothing fancy. Chicken and rice are things my mother would argue about. Harper took the dish like a person handed a rope. "Thank you," she said, sincerity uncluttered by pride. The neighbor's gaze slid to Mateo, recognized him, then politely chose not to. "Suppose you need anything, Buzz." She left before the moment could turn into something complicated. They ate standing at the counter while the babies slept in brief alignment. The casserole tasted like someone else's kitchen on a good day. Mateo washed the dishes after being asked, pushed his sleeves to his forearms, and water steamed them. He found the drying rack without opening the wrong drawer twice. "Stop," Harper said when he reached for a dish towel. "You'll make me expect it." "Then I'll have to keep doing it," he replied. And the way he said it made it sound less like penance, more like a habit he intended to learn. Evening gathered itself. The apartment dimmed to its night geometry lamps, haloed in corners, the streets gold climbing the walls in quiet bands. Their voices found a lower register because small sleeping bodies had set the terms. Harper stood at the window with Gabriel on her shoulder, rocking by degrees. The city outside existed in its usual outrage. The siren far off, the laugh too loud, the muffled bass from a car that believed in itself. Here, breath and heartbeat create a different rhythm. "Security," Mateo said from the table, as if the word had asked to be acknowledged. "They'll stay on the block for a few nights. Far enough away that you won't see them. Close enough to be useful if someone tries the buzzer too hard." She stared at the glass, her reflection a dark brushstroke on dusk. "I hate that you make sense." "So do I," he admitted. And the honesty in it pulled a slight involuntary sound from her. Something nearly like a laugh broken before it became one. Silence widened, but not emptily. He dried his hands. She shifted Gabriel higher, a kiss pressed to his hair, through fabric as natural as breath. "Mateo," she said, "the name is careful." He waited. "If I give you a key," she continued, eyes still on the street, "it isn't some ribbon-tied symbol. It's logistics. These stairs are in the middle of the night. Bottles. If we need an ER, the van will run at 3 a.m. I don't make gestures anymore." He didn't move. "I don't need a gesture." She reached into the drawer beside the stove and took out a plain silver key. It wasn't new. It had a scratch through the middle where it had once fallen on concrete and been found again. She held it between thumb and forefinger as if testing its weight in the air. "This doesn't guarantee anything," she said. "Not forgiveness, not a future. It opens a door. That's all." He crossed the room as if approaching a child's crib in the dark. Slow, careful, grateful not to be asked to prove his gratitude. He didn't immediately close his fingers when she placed the key in his palm. He let the cold metal sit there and teach his skin what it meant. "Then I'll use it like that," he said. "To come when there's work. To leave when there isn't. To knock on the nights you don't want me here." Her chin lifted something like relief and warning, and she shared the same expression. Good. They stood too close and not at all the kind of nearness people earn by eliminating the noise between what's said and what's done. The night stretched. They learned the apartment's version of a lullaby, pipes ticking as they cooled the elevator cable, sighing, someone's radio 2 floors down, singing to itself. The babies woke in rotation, as if conferring in their sleep. Tasks are divided without ceremony. She measured. He shook. He burped. She changed. They switched. He lifted Sienna with a steadiness that wasn't there yesterday. She handed him Noelle, not because she needed to, but because she chose to. Later, Harper sat on the floor by the bassinets, back against the couch knees, drawn up, hands clasped loosely around her shins. Mateo lowered himself to the rug beside her, leaving a courtesy inch, like a gentleman, on a crowded subway. The television was off. The city had quieted the way cities do, when they remember they are temporary. My mother used to say, "Love is a room that gets bigger when you learn to stand still," Harper said, not sure why she chose that memory or this hour. He thought about it. "Standing still has never been my talent." "It might be theirs," she said, tilting her head toward the bassinets. "They measure worth in minutes of skin, not in shares." His smile was small and unshowy. "They've already restructured me. You always did talk like a prospectus." Occupational hazard. She didn't smile back, but something in her gaze stopped bracing. "You can sleep on the couch tonight," she said. "There's a blanket under the bed. Don't rummage or you'll find the things I don't want to explain." "Understood," he said, and meant it. They rose together, not in sync yet, but close enough that their shadows crossed once before separating. He pulled the blanket free without looking at anything that wasn't the blanket. She checked one last time that the monitors blinked with the right confidence. At the doorway to the bedroom, she paused. "Mateo." He looked up from shaking out the blanket. "If you're here at 3 when someone starts screaming," she said, "I won't be surprised anymore." He nodded, a simple tilt, the shape of agreement you make to another shift worker in the middle of a very long night. When the apartment finally exhaled, it did so into an ordinary quiet. No headlines, no podium, just the rhythmic proof that 5 small hearts had carried themselves across a river and found this shore. Mateo lay on the couch awake, despite exhaustion, the key warm in his palm, where he'd held it too long. Through the slatted blind, a streetlight cut the dark into measured bands that moved every time a car went by. On the other side of the wall, Harper's breath found its own, not even restless, the sound of someone who had made room for one more weight without dropping the ones she already held. Brooklyn kept its practical promises: outside trash trucks at dawn, footsteps on stairs, the first kettle of the morning. Inside, a third-floor light waited in the corner for whoever rose first. Tonight, it would be both of them. Not because a story demanded it, but because milk did. Because diapers did. Love is occasionally nothing more glamorous than an alarm that rings repeatedly until 2 people choose to get up without speech or spectacle. The first week in Brooklyn blurred into a rhythm Mateo could not have imagined. Days ran together in a mosaic of bottles, diapers' cries, and the fragile hush that followed them. The empire of glass towers and boardrooms he once ruled seemed impossibly distant. Here the walls were painted in softer shades, chipped at the corners, but alive with something far more real than the sheen of marble. Harper lived in motion. She moved between bassinets like a conductor of an orchestra. No one else could hear her hands steady, even when her eyes showed exhaustion. She did not complain, ask, or wait for rescue. She was a force, equal parts fierce and quiet, weaving order out of chaos. Mateo tried to match her. He rose when she rose, learned the bottles by trial and error, burned his fingers on a kettle he hadn't realized, whistled in protest. He discovered the angle of rocking that calmed Noel, the soft humming that stilled Sienna, and the slight circular pressure that eased Gabriel's fussing belly. It was clumsy, imperfect, and still somehow it mattered. But beneath the growing rhythm, cracks began to show, not in the walls around them, but in the invisible places where their histories met. On the fourth morning, Harper found Mateo reading one of her notebooks at the kitchen counter. The small, spiral-bound kind she had filled with feedings ounces, weights, sleep cycles. He wasn't rifling, just standing there, careful, as if the words might bruise if touched too hard. "You shouldn't," she said, her voice quiet but edged. He looked up, guilt flickering across his face. "I wanted to understand how you did it all." Her jaw tightened. "I didn't write it for you." The space between them shrank into silence. The babies rustled in their bassinets, unaware of the old wounds pressing against new air. "I'm sorry," he said, closing the notebook. "I wasn't trying to. I know what you were trying." She cut in softer now, but no less sharp. "But you don't get to study absence like it's a subject. You were absent." The words pierced deeper than any argument. Mateo swallowed them whole, the apology rising in his chest, too fragile to survive the air. He set the notebook down and stepped back. Harper turned away, her shoulders stiff, but the truth hung heavy between them. That night, exhaustion pressed harder than usual. Two babies woke in tandem, their cries ricocheting through the small apartment. Harper reached for them at once, her movements automatic. Mateo tried to take one, but she brushed past him. Her eyes focused, her body moving with the instinct of someone who had carried this burden alone for too long. "Let me," he said, reaching again. "I've got it," she snapped, sharper than she intended. He froze, the words stinging not for their cruelty, but for what they revealed. She didn't yet trust him with their chaos. The cries grew louder. He stepped back, hands at his sides, watching as she soothed them both, rocking in an impossible balance of rhythm and patience. Within minutes, the noise subsided. The room quieted. Harper sank into the chair, her chest rising fast, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. Mateo stood across from her, helpless, ashamed. "You don't have to do it alone," he whispered. Her laugh was low, brittle. "But I know how to." That's the difference. Days passed, and those small victories continued. Mateo mastering burping technique, Harper letting him carry Gabriel without correction. The tension grew. The storm of the outside world still rattled at their windows. Headlines speculating on every move, photographs of Hamilton Tower plastered across tabloids, whispers that wouldn't quiet. Harper's fear became visible in how she double-checked the locks at night, kept curtains drawn even at noon, and flinched when footsteps lingered too long in the stairwell. One evening, as she folded laundry, the television blared with a debate on a late-night panel. Analysts argued about Mateo's secret family and what it meant for Hamilton dynamics and Harper herself. A photo of her granny pulled from some archived university article flashed on the screen. "Who is Harper Grant?" the headline demanded. She turned the TV off so fast that the screen cracked at the corner. Mateo, standing in the kitchen, looked over at her, the sight of her shoulders trembling though her face remained still lodged in his chest. "They don't know you," he said. "They don't need to," she whispered. "But they'll tear me apart anyway." The quiet after was heavier than any cry. The breaking point came on a Saturday evening. The babies had finally settled the apartment hushed, except for the ticking of an old clock on the shelf. Harper sat at the table, a mug of tea cooling in her hands. Mateo leaned against the counter sleeves, rolled his eyes, shadowed with exhaustion. For a moment, the silence felt almost companionable. Then Harper spoke. "When I left you," she began, her voice steady but low, "I didn't plan to disappear. I planned to breathe, to see if I could exist without drowning in your shadow." He stiffened, but he didn't interrupt. "Then I found out I was pregnant. It was a mistake that the tests were wrong. I spent hours staring at the results like they were written in another language." Her fingers tightened on the mug. "And then I heard the heartbeats. 5. All at once." Mateo's breath caught his body, folding slightly, as if bracing against the wind. "I wanted to tell you," she continued. "I drove once to your office. I sat in the parking garage with my hands on the wheel, watching you pace through the glass walls above me. You looked untouchable, like there was no room left for someone like me." His throat closed. "I would have come down." "You didn't see me," she said, "and I couldn't force myself into a world where I already didn't fit." The silence that followed stretched long, carrying the weight of years unsaid. Finally, Mateo moved closer, his voice low. "I didn't know how to make room, but I'm learning now." Her eyes lifted, wet but fierce. "Learning doesn't erase what we've lived." "No," he admitted, "but it could change what comes next." The night did not resolve. It only folded into itself, fragile, unresolved. Harper slept lightly, waking at every sound. Mateo lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, the key she had given him on the table beside him, like a promise and a burden. In the early hours, a baby's cry pulled them both up. They moved together this time, no competition, no hesitation. She handed him Noel, trusting his arms without words. He soothed her with patience, the cry softening until it dissolved into sleep. When Harper returned from changing Gabriel, she found him still holding Noel, her face pressed against his chest, his eyes closed in something that looked dangerously like peace. For the first time, she didn't feel the urge to snatch the child back. She only stood in the doorway watching. The following day, the apartment was visited by quiet, no casseroles, phone calls, or knocks on the door. The outside world buzzed somewhere else, mercifully distant. Harper sat on the couch, a pile of laundry beside her. Mateo joined her without asking, folding alongside her. They worked silently, two pairs of hands moving over fabric, turning chaos into order, one small shirt at a time. At one point, their hands brushed. Neither pulled away. The air shifted, subtle, unannounced, but undeniable. The cracks in their armor had not closed. But for the first time, they let the light through. The first hint of trouble came on a Tuesday afternoon, disguised as something ordinary. Harper was rinsing bottles at the sink. Her sleeves rolled to the elbows when a faint murmur rose from the stairwell outside. At first, she dismissed it, neighbors arguing, footsteps climbing. But then came the unmistakable rhythm of more than one set of shoes stopping at her door. The knock that followed wasn't tentative. It carried weight, a certainty that didn't belong to a visitor. Harper froze, water running cold over her hands. Mateo, who was crouched on the floor, adjusting Gabriel's blanket, stiffened. He looked up at her, reading the fear in her eyes, even before she whispered, "They found us." The knock came again, louder this time, followed by voices polished, insistent. Reporters. Words filtered through the wood like shards of glass. "Ms. Grant, are you in there? Mr. Hamilton, Can we ask? Your children. Are they? Her stomach dropped. Instinctively, she moved toward the bassinets, shielding them with her body, as if the wooden door might splinter any second. The babies stirred at the sound, their restlessness echoing her own pulse. Mateo rose, his frame drawn tall, every muscle sharpened. He crossed the room in 3 strides, placing a steady hand on the doorknob without opening it. Leave it. Harper hissed, her voice low, urgent. They won't stop, he murmured back. Then don't give them a reason to keep pushing. For a moment he hesitated. His entire life had been built on facing down questions, on standing where the noise was loudest. But this wasn't a boardroom, wasn't a press conference. This was Harper's apartment, with 5 newborns in bassinets and fear trembling in her shoulders. He stepped back. The reporters lingered, knocking, calling their persistence, scratching against the fragile walls. Finally, footsteps retreated, though. Harper didn't breathe until silence returned. Only then did she turn on him. Her voice, sharp, low, controlled. Do you see? This is what your name does. It doesn't just open doors, it breaks them down. Mateo swallowed hard, guilt carving itself into his features. He wanted to say he hadn't asked for this. He wanted to promise he would fix it. But promises here felt like smoke. I'll increase security, he said. I'll make sure you can't stop them with guards, Mateo. She shook her head, her hands trembling as she lifted Micah into her arms. You can't build a wall high enough. They'll find cracks and will always pay the price. The baby fussed, pressing his tiny face into her collarbone. Harper closed her eyes, whispering into his curls. Mateo stood there, aching at the sight, knowing every word she spoke was accurate. The tension of the afternoon lingered long into the evening. Harper fed Leora in the rocking chair, her movements precise but taut, while Mateo paced the narrow kitchen, making phone calls in a voice so low it was almost another language. Words like surveillance injunction, cease and desist, drifted into the air, foreign in the intimacy of the small apartment. When he returned to the living room, Harper looked up at him with eyes rimmed red from exhaustion. What happens when they publish our address? He didn't answer immediately. He knew the likelihood. He knew the appetite of the press. We'll move, he said finally. Her body went rigid. This is my home. He said it won't be safe, his tone gentle but firm. It's all I have, she countered, and something in her voice was not about brick or plaster. He faltered. She wasn't clinging to walls. She was clinging to the life she had built when no one else had been there. To uproot her now felt like erasing proof of her survival. Then we'll protect it, he said at last. Whatever it takes. But the world was not so easily kept outside. 2 nights later, Harper woke to a baby crying, and another noise beneath it, a flash of light, not from the street lamp, but sharper, intrusive bleeding through the curtains. She rose, her heart seizing. At the window, she pulled the curtain back just an inch. Below, a photographer crouched in the street, his lens tilted upward like a weapon. Panic surged. She drew the curtain closed, clutching the fabric as if it were armor. Mateo stirred on the couch, waking at her sharp breath. What is it? She turned to him, her voice breaking. They're outside, taking pictures of the windows. He was on his feet, instantly crossing to the window, his jaw set. He didn't pull the curtain. He already knew she wasn't exaggerating. Harper. He reached for her, but she stepped back, Micah stirring in her arms. This is precisely what I feared. She whispered, her words trembling like glass. They don't see children. They see spectacle. Mateo's chest tightened. For all his resources, for all his power, he could not erase the flashbulbs already burned into the night. The following day, exhaustion and fear conspired into sharp edges. You think you can control this, Harper said, as she folded blankets with quick, angry precision. But you can't. You can't control them any more than you controlled me. Mateo froze mid-step, her words striking like a blade. "I'm not trying to control you," he said, his voice low. "Aren't you?" she demanded, turning on him. "Every solution you offer is bigger and louder. Guards, lawyers, relocation. But you don't listen when I tell you what it costs me, what it costs them." Her voice cracked, and the sound of it gutted him more than her anger. He closed the space between them, slow, careful. "Tell me then," he said softly. "Please tell me how to keep you safe without destroying what you've built." She looked at him, her eyes shimmering, torn between fury and longing. "I don't know," she whispered. "That's the problem. I don't know how to live in your world without losing mine." The babies stirred their cries, cutting the air like punctuation. Harper turned away, scooping Noelle into her arms, her silence louder than any argument. That night, fate struck again. Gabriel's breathing turned shallow, uneven. The monitor beeped with rising urgency. Harper's hands shook as she adjusted his position, whispering his name, trying to coax the rhythm back. Mateo was beside her in seconds. "What is it?" "He's struggling," she said, panic raw in her voice. "His lungs, they said it might—" "Call the doctor," Mateo said sharply, already reaching for the emergency kit. His hands, usually precise in boardrooms, trembled as he followed the nurse's instructions from memory. Harper clutched Gabriel closer, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Stay with me. Stay." The seconds stretched unbearably, until finally Gabriel's chest rose more evenly, his cries weak but present. The monitor steadied. Harper sagged, tears falling unchecked as she pressed her lips to his temple. Mateo sat back on his heels, his own breath shuddering out of him. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was Gabriel's small, stubborn breath. When Harper finally looked up, her eyes were wet but fierce. "This is what matters. Not headlines, not reputations. This." Mateo nodded, the weight of truth pressing into his bones. "I know." And he did. Perhaps for the first time he truly did. In the fragile quiet that followed, Harper sat on the floor, Gabriel against her chest, her body shaking with the aftershock of fear. Mateo lowered himself beside her, close, but not touching. The city beyond their window buzzed with insatiable hunger. The cameras would not vanish. The questions would not cease. But here in this room, breath by fragile breath, something unspoken shifted. For the first time since she had handed him the key, Harper did not flinch when he reached for her. His hand brushed hers, tentative, steady. She did not pull away, and though words failed them both, the silence said what they could not, that the world might knock, might flash, might roar, but inside this fragile space, they would hold. Together. The first light of dawn slipped through the blinds, tracing soft lines across the worn hardwood floor of Harper's apartment. It was quiet, almost impossibly so after weeks of overlapping cries and alarms. For the first time, all 5 babies slept at once, their small bodies curled in the bassinets, like a constellation finally aligned. Harper sat on the couch, elbows braced against her knees, her hands cupping a mug of tea gone cold. She should have been resting, but her chest refused to be still. Mateo stood at the window, the curtain half drawn, watching the street below, where a black car idled silently, his security invisible but constant. The world was waiting. She knew it the way a storm announces itself, not by thunder, but by the air tightening. The press hadn't forgotten. The whispers hadn't stilled. And yet, here in this apartment, small, cluttered, sacred, there was a pause, a breath, a fragile space carved from noise. Harper looked at Mateo, He had shed his tie days ago. His shirt sleeves rolled the lines of his face etched by sleepless nights. He was still a billionaire whose name carried weight, but he was also something else now, a father who had learned to rock a baby at 3 a.m. without instruction. A man who had stayed when walking away would have been easier. And still she did not know if it was enough. That evening, Harper's sister Camille visited for the first time. She brought casseroles and blankets, her laughter spilling into the small apartment like sunlight through a cracked door. Camille cooed over the babies, her hands moving with ease, her eyes warm but sharp when they landed on Mateo. "So this is him," she said, her voice carrying both curiosity and challenge. Mateo inclined his head steady. "Mateo Hamilton." "I know who you are," Camille replied. She tucked a blanket more snugly around Noel. "The question is, do you know who they are? Not just in headlines." "Here, I'm learning," Mateo said. Harper held her breath, waiting for Camille to scoff. Instead, her sister studied him for a moment longer, then looked back at Harper with a glance that said more than words. "It's your choice." When Camille left, Harper lingered at the door, her hand pressed against the frame long after it closed. Mateo came up behind her, careful not to crowd. "You don't have to decide tonight," he said softly. She turned her eyes, catching his. "Don't I?" Days passed in a rhythm that was neither easy nor unbearable. Mateo stayed not as a guest, but not yet as something permanent. He learned to fold onesies, sterilize bottles, and hum lullabies off-key. Harper began to let him, though, not without watching, measuring, and testing. One night, when Leora's cries stretched long and relentless, Harper's body sagged against the armchair, exhaustion dragging her down. Mateo came forward, his arms outstretched. "Let me," he said. This time she didn't argue. She handed Leora to him, her eyes closing even before her arms were empty. When she woke hours later, the baby was asleep in Mateo's chest, his head tilted back against the couch, his mouth parted in unguarded fatigue. Something inside her shifted, then quiet but undeniable. But trust was not born in a single night. On a Wednesday, Harper's phone buzzed with a message from a colleague at the nonprofit she once worked for. A picture attached a tabloid cover. The mother of 5, who is Harper Grant. The photo was grainy, taken from across the street. Harper carrying groceries. Her expression caught mid-step. Her stomach churned. She placed the phone face down on the counter. "They found me again," she said, her voice flat. Mateo's jaw tightened. "I'll have it taken down." "You can't erase it," she whispered. "This is what I feared. My life. Dissected." He reached for her hand, but she pulled it back. "They'll grow up under that spotlight," she said. 5 tiny lives picked apart before they've even taken their first steps. "I can't let them drown in your world, Mateo." "They won't drown," he said firmly. "Not if I stand with them." Her eyes lifted, burning. "But will you stand with me?" The question hung in the air, heavier than any headline. The answer came not in words, but in what followed. That night, the babies refused to sleep one after another. The apartment was filled with the sounds of hunger, fussing, and tiny protests against the world. Harper moved with frantic precision, exhaustion blurring her vision. Mateo moved with her, his large hands fumbling, but determined, his patience holding where hers frayed. At one point, Harper nearly collapsed onto the couch, tears threatening. Mateo knelt before her, a bottle in his hand, Sienna in his arms. "You're not alone," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "Not anymore." She looked at him, then really looked, the man who had once been unreachable, now holding their child, with hands that trembled, not from fear of breaking, but from the weight of responsibility he refused to set down. Her chest cracked open. The next morning, Harper found herself by the window, the skyline of Manhattan distant across the river. She remembered the girl she had been at MIT debating with Mateo until the lights went out laughing as she coded past midnight. She remembered the woman she had become carrying 5 lives alone, her body heavy, her silence heavier, and she realized that both versions of her were here now. Mateo approached quietly, his reflection appearing beside hers in the glass. "I don't want to be your shadow," he said softly. "I want to be your partner. With them. With you. If you'll let me." Her throat tightened. "Partnership means presence," she whispered. "Not gestures, not speeches. Just showing up." He nodded. "Then I'll keep showing up. Every morning. Every night." For a long moment she said nothing. Then slowly she turned and placed her hand in his. It was not forgiveness. It was not surrender. It was a beginning. Weeks later, the apartment looked different. Not in its walls or furniture, but in its air. The babies had grown, their cries sharper, their eyes more alert. Harper moved with less panic, more rhythm. Mateo moved with her, not perfectly, but steadily. One evening, as they tucked the last babies into their bassinets, Harper stood back watching. Mateo adjusted Micah's blanket with careful hands, then glanced at her. "What is it?" he asked. Her voice was quiet but certain. "I want you here. Not just for them. For me." The words landed like a vow. Mateo's breath caught, but he didn't rush forward or break the moment with grand gestures. He nodded, his eyes steady. "I'm here," he said. And this time she believed him. As the night settled, Harper curled onto the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, the day's weight finally softening. Mateo sat beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was full of memory, possibility, and something fragile but real. She looked at him, her voice almost a whisper. "Can we make this work?" He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "We already are." And in that small apartment with 5 tiny breaths steady in the next room, Harper allowed herself to believe it. If this story touched you, if Harper and Mateo's journey stirred something in your heart, let us know what you felt. Comment your thoughts, share your reflections, and follow the channel to avoid missing what comes next. Love, second chances, and the courage to stay are only the beginning.